Hi, Mr. President.
Ava, it is good to see you. You look wonderful.
It's
And
wonderful to see you, sir.
for those who are just kind of listening in, full disclosure, I love Ava DuVernay, and and she's a buddy.
I'm so happy to be sitting with you to talk about a book that I really, really enjoyed so much. I knew that I was going to like this book because within the first few pages, three words appear that I really embrace. I don't know. And I think it becomes difficult for people in positions of power, not even national global positions, but even in our own lives to just say, I don't know, and what that invites. And so I just want to thank you. I think the book was filled with I don't knows and figuring it out, and it made it really real and rooted. And so let's talk about it.
Well, let's do it. Thank you.
Well, the first thing we have to do is turn it over to one of the students from Southern California who has a question. So we want the young people to go first. And there's a young student from Inglewood High School. His name is Tariq Stone, who has a question. So we'll hear his first.
Hi, my name is Tariq Stone, and I'm a senior at Inglewood High School, and I'm also an aspiring filmmaker. Right now, we're in a period of being extremely divided, and we're finally starting to see our first signs of hope. President Obama, what do you think is the most important next step in overcoming our differences as a nation?
Tariq, great question. And by the way, you should study Ava's films if you're interested in being a filmmaker. A great role model who's joined us. Uh, Look, what was interesting, even writing the book, I was tracing how deep rooted divisions in our society were coming to the surface. We are a big, complicated, noisy, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. And that's part of what sets America apart as this great experiment. And what that means is there's always going to be some clashes of ideas, notions of the good life, you know, ideas about how we should organize ourselves in government, what government responsibilities are, what they aren't. But the one thing that I think we can do is work to see each other's humanity and understand that we all are deserving of dignity and respect, and that we all can abide by a certain process for resolving those differences. And then the second thing is learning how to listen actively for people's stories and knowing a little bit more about other people's history and our own. Right now, for example, we have a, a huge amount of division around how police should be operating, particularly in communities of color. Well, if we don't know the story that Ava, you, for example, have told in some of your documentaries and docudramas of how police actions have operated in the past, then it's harder for us to understand why there would be suspicion and fear in the African American community or Latino communities about police presence, lack of cooperation, potentials for conflict. So part of coming together and being able to work together and live together constructively is knowing each other's stories.
One of the things that I read in your book that I really liked was you said, I challenged my own assumptions. This is when you were really young, like in the Occidental. And that's just something that you started doing and don't believe everything you think kind of thing. What are some of can you give us just a couple of real leadership nuggets?
Yeah. I think that's a
Hardcore,
great
like the
question.
real thing.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a couple. And these are fairly high level, but I think they do apply in whatever circumstance you're in. Number one, and I think this is the most important and sometimes gets the most neglected, is understanding what is it that you're trying to accomplish? What is the mission of the group, team, or institution that you are trying to lead? A lot of leadership is making decisions, many of which are going to be imperfect. They're going to be suboptimal. I write about this in the book a lot. The fact that as president, nothing arrived on my desk where there was a perfect answer, because if there was, somebody else would have made that decision and reported to me, Mr. President, we came up with this perfect answer. The only time they put something on my desk was, man, we can't figure this out. This is a mess. And so you were always working with, all right, this is the best of some bad options that you've got available to you. You can't make those decisions, and your organization and team can't make those decisions if you don't know what are your first principles. What's the most important thing? So that's point number one. Point number two, and this applies to any organization. Do not be afraid to have people who are smarter than you working with you. So much of organizational life and human life is wrapped up in people wanting to be seen as the most important person, and as a consequence, don't like being challenged, want to make sure that people are, in the right pecking order.
Mhm.
And I think more mistakes are made, more bad culture is created in organizations from people being more worried about their own position and self-importance than they are about the mission and getting things done.
So you're in a position where everyone doesn't agree with you. Everyone doesn't agree with what you did, who you are, what you say. This is just a fact of many of our lives, but you even more so. I love this passage, the part of your book that talks about your visit to Selma at a really pivotal time for you, when Congressman Lewis had to tell you, kid, I like you. You're a good kid, but you know, the Clintons, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go this way. And it was I love there's a part where you're in Selma, and then there's was it Reverend Lowry who gives the
Yeah.
fiery speech about you, and
Joseph Lowry.
Reverend Shuttlesworth is there, and C.T.
Right.
Vivian, my favorite. They're like the Avengers to me. These men, and
Yeah.
and somewhere in there, Reverend Otis Moss calls, and he talks about, look, the Moses generation, right? And you're a part of the Joshua generation, and you got to build on what we did. And sometimes folks are going to like it, and sometimes folks aren't. And so I wanted you to just talk a little bit about that, but in the context of this next generation, and specifically right. about issues of law enforcement, because there right. are some ideas that are different from before, ideas that right. may not speak to reform, that speak to a reimagining.
Well, absolutely, and I think you're picking up on a really important theme. So you had this civil rights generation of giants who you know as well as anyone fought battles that, compared to us, were so fraught with risk, personal risk, physical risk. With so few resources and the odds so stacked against them. And what they achieved through intelligence, ingenuity, courage, resilience, spirit, it's hard to imagine. And they were so young at the time too, right? I mean, they were kids. So by the time, these are the folks who inspire me to get into public life in the first place, because I was never inspired by politicians. I was inspired by movement leaders. The fact that I got to know these individuals was itself this great gift that helps fortify me and my sense of self and identity and sense of purpose in my life. So these are all heroes to me. Reverend Moss, who I love, not as famous as some of the others, but just a wise man and a great pastor as well as a civil rights leader. he writes me a letter and he says, look, don't let all this fussing and sniping get you down. We're part of the Moses generation. We could take it a certain way to a certain place, but we couldn't get all the way to the promised land. You're part of the Joshua generation. You then take the torch and you move it forward. And we're not always going to agree with you or understand what you're doing. But, you need to understand that our greatest legacy is going to be you carrying that torch past places that we could go. And it was a hugely important thing to bolster my confidence to hear him and people like Reverend Lowry and C.T. Vivian say things like that. Now, I now have gray hair. I am no longer the young upstart. And I do have a similar relationship to some of the younger activists now, in the sense that I ran my stage of the race. I moved things, I believe, in a forward direction, created new space for new conversations, allowed a whole new generation to grow up and take certain things for granted. And I mean that in a positive way, i.e., they had different assumptions than the Moses generation did, or even my generation did, about what was possible. A lot of my advice now is actually just practical. And there are times, I think, where that advice is taken in ways that is seen as trying to, rein in activism. And actually, it's more just think strategically. So, for example, and this is a very concrete thing that I've said to young activists, the vast majority of criminal justice issues and law enforcement issues are determined at the state and local level, not at the federal level. So being really clear and strategic about who's the state's attorney or district attorney in a jurisdiction, because they're the ones who are going to decide whether or not to prosecute a police officer who's used excessive force. Who's writing the collective bargaining agreement between the police union and that municipality? Because that will often determine what the rules are in terms of training, accountability, and so forth. You have to focus on those things. Maybe I can at least be in a dialogue with young activists. Sometimes they'll be right. Sometimes I may actually have something that makes some sense. But I'm glad that they're out there challenging assumptions, not just assuming that the way we did things was the way they should do things.
Thank you for that. It's time to hear from another student. This young woman is named Grace Lee. She's a junior at Buena Park High School. And it's time for her to ask her question.
Hello, I'm Grace, and I'm a junior at Buena Park High School. I'm also the editor-in-chief of my school newspaper and host of the Inspire to Aspire podcast. I've been reading A Promised Land, and I really like your writing style. It's made me think a lot about legacies and what we leave behind. President Obama, what is the one thing that you'd like to be remembered for?
Grace, when you think about legacy in the context of the presidency, it's hard to get the kind of distance you need for perspective, because part of what you have to do is to sit back and see, all right, how's this all going to play out? One legacy, I hope, is that I modeled a leadership that, whatever mistakes we made, showed it's possible for somebody to be elected president and tackle big problems and do so without scandal, without self-interest. And the second legacy I hope I have is to have inspired a whole new generation of young people to get involved in politics, to be activists, to feel like their voice matters. I think there are young activists on a wide range of issues, from climate to issues of systemic racism in the criminal justice system that were encouraged, inspired by our campaign or the work that we did. That is a great legacy. When you see people picking up the baton and doing great work, and you think, all right, maybe I sparked some of that. That feels pretty good.